On March 18th, 2007, right here at the ivy-covered campus of the University of Chicago, an inter-Orthodox theological conference was held. The conference was titled Orthodoxy and Modern Ecumenism. The conference was organized by the Holy Metropolis of the Genuine Greek Orthodox Church of America, more popularly known as the Greek Orthodox Old Calendar Church. The Old Calendar Church is quite conservative and very traditional. Some would say that it is too traditional. Among those who hold this negative view of the Traditionalist Old Calendar Church is the Greek Orthodox New Calendar Church, whose members comprise the vast majority of the Greek Orthodox Christians worldwide. Members of this less traditional or more modernist church were invited to speak at the conference, and several of their clergy did in fact agree to do so. But a few days before the conference, they declined to make any public presentations. However, members of the New Calendar Church did attend the conference and did participate in the question and answer portion of the conference. One of the speakers at the conference, which took place right down this hall, was Father Maximus Moretta, who is a traditionalist Old Calendarist Greek Orthodox higher monk from the Holy Ascension Monastery in New York. The paper he presented was titled The Problem of Traditional New Calendarism. The term traditional New Calendarism sounds like an oxymoron, and indeed it is. Father Maximus chose this paradoxical phrase for the title of his essay with a distinct purpose, a purpose that becomes clear when listening to him. In his presentation, Father Maximus made a strong case that the modernist New Calendar Orthodox Church and all those Orthodox churches worldwide that are in communion with it have ceased to be truly Orthodox due to having embraced a non-traditional form of Ecumenism, which professes that there is more than one true church. That was almost 9 years ago. And in that span of time, the modernist mindset of Ecumenism has made even greater inroads within the highest levels of the official world orthodoxy. Even the Pope of Rome was received by the Patriarch of Constantinople as a brother bishop. In traditional Orthodox views, this is inappropriate, and the involvement of Orthodox hierarchs in even non-Christian prayer has been seen more and more frequently.
You may close your eyes if you want to enjoy the great vows in your inner voice.
In other words, the situation of world orthodoxy that Father Maximus described here 8 years ago has gone even further away from traditional Orthodox views. His warning, and the warning of the Orthodox Church he belongs to, seems to have fallen on deaf ears. That is why Greek Orthodox Christian television has decided to present this program again, and with a renewed hope that a new audience may be edified by the facts as they are presented by Father Maximus. Be sure to view the affirmation question and answer portion, which is quite enlightening as to the phronema of traditional modernism, a phronema which is in fact a mindset that has come to reside in almost every corner of Christendom. At the channel site for this program, the viewer will find a link to the transcript of Father Maximus's essay, along with the link to another one of Father Maximus's essays on the problem of ecumenism and why it so concerns traditionalist Orthodox Christians.
Nonetheless, I will take up the challenge and demonstrate that the New Calendar Church has unquestionably espoused heretical teachings in the most official capacity possible, that of public proclamation by a patriarch, and approval of the proclamation by the Synod of the Church. In 1948, the World Council of Churches was created, a worldwide organization whose sole purpose for existing is to promote ecumenism and the non-Orthodox ecclesiological principles upon which ecumenism is based. The Patriarchate of Constantinople and a number of other Orthodox churches were founding members, and thus showed that they wholeheartedly espoused the Council's goals and beliefs. Indeed, they helped formulate those goals and beliefs. The Charter of the Council states, "The primary purpose of the Fellowship of Churches in the World Council of Churches is to call one another to visible unity in one faith and one Eucharistic fellowship. In seeking koinonia in faith and life, witness and service, the churches through the Council will promote the prayerful search for forgiveness and reconciliation in a spirit of mutual accountability, the development of deeper relationships through theological dialogue, and the sharing of human, spiritual, and material resources with one another. Facilitate common witness in each place and in all places, and support each other in their work for mission and evangelism. Nurture the growth of an ecumenical consciousness through processes of education and the vision of life and community, rooted in each particular cultural context. Assist one another in the relationships to and with people of other faith communities. Foster renewal and growth in unity, worship, mission, and service. In order to foster the one ecumenical movement, the Council will nurture relations with and among churches, especially within, but also beyond its membership. Establish and maintain relations with national councils, regional conferences of churches, organizations of Christian world communions, and other ecumenical bodies. Support ecumenical initiatives at regional, national, and local levels. Facilitate the creation of networks among ecumenical organizations. Work towards maintaining the coherence of the one ecumenical movement in its diverse manifestations. These principles are totally unacceptable for a person with an Orthodox understanding of the Church. They illustrate that the heresy the Orthodox are confronting is not simply union with this or that heretical church, which has not yet happened except in the case of the Modernist. Rather, the heresy is the idea that heretical groups outside the Church are indeed somehow part of the Church, and that the Orthodox Church is part of a larger whole comprised of both Orthodox and the heterodox. Now, any statement which gives any ecclesial standing whatsoever to a body outside the Church is a heretical statement, because the Orthodox Church is the entirety of the Church. The other so-called churches are not churches at all, but false assemblies set up in opposition to the one true Church. They are anti-churches. The Charter and Mission, even the very name of the World Council of Churches, cuts at the root of the doctrine of orthodoxy by placing all churches on the same ontological level. Moreover, the World Council of Churches expressly recognizes only one ecumenical movement, that is, its own. It does not leave any room for a valid Orthodox ecumenism, which would seek to convert the heterodox. No one can claim that the purpose of Orthodox involvement in ecumenism is to witness to orthodoxy, since the only side of orthodoxy being presented is precisely whatever can be brought into seeming conformity with the principles set out in the World Council of Churches Charter, a document which, as we have just seen, denies the Orthodox teaching on the Church. Ecumenism is the exact opposite of evangelization. Any church which joins the World Council of Churches thereby embraces the ecclesiological concepts upon which the Council is founded. These concepts become part of the beliefs of the individual church in question. The Patriarchate of Constantinople and the other New Calendarist churches not only accepted these principles and helped formulate them, but have proved their continued adherence to them in a variety of ways over the past 60 years. Thus, there can be no doubt that the official doctrine of the New Calendarist churches is one of heretical ecumenism, regardless of the fact that many of the New Calendarist faithful personally agree with their church's position. Once the New Calendar churches had espoused the principles of ecumenism, they were not slow to act upon them in concrete ways. one of the very first major steps which put into practice the ecclesiological teaching of ecumenism was the lifting of anathemas of 1054 against the Roman Catholic Church. Patriarch Athenagoras and the Synod of the Patriarchate of Constantinople took this action in December 1965. In a joint statement with Pope Paul VI, they declared that they regret the offensive words, the reproaches without foundation, and the reprehensible gestures which on both sides have marked or accompanied the sad events of this period. They likewise regret and remove both from memory and from the midst of the Church the sentences of excommunication which followed these events, the memory of which has influenced actions up to our day and has hindered closer relations in charity, and they commit these excommunications to oblivion. Through the action of the Holy Spirit, those differences will be overcome through regret for historical wrongs and for an efficacious determination to arrive at a common understanding and expression of the faith of the Apostles and its demands. The meaning of this official document is clear. The Orthodox condemnation of Latin heresies is without foundation and must be obliterated from memory, and we do not yet understand the faith of the Apostles. In September 1990, official delegates from all the New Calendarist churches met in Chambézy, Switzerland, with official representatives of the Monophysite churches. They restated those points on Christology on which the Orthodox and Monophysites have always agreed. They ignored or dismissed as semantical misunderstandings those points on which they disagree, and then they declared, in the light of our agreed statement on Christology, as well as of the above common affirmations, we have now clearly understood that both families, that is, both the Orthodox and the Monophysites, have always loyally maintained the same authentic Orthodox Christological faith and the unbroken continuity of the apostolic tradition, although they have used Christological terms in different ways. It is this common faith and continuous loyalty to the apostolic tradition that should be the basis for our unity and communion. Both families agree that all the anathemas and condemnations of the past, which now divide us, should be lifted by the churches in order that the last obstacle to the full unity and communion of our two families can be removed by the grace and power of God. Both families agree that the lifting of anathemas and condemnations will be consummated on the basis that the councils and fathers previously anathematized or condemned are not heretical. The Chambézy Agreement is an open espousal of the ancient heresy of Monophysitism. Its acceptance by the Orthodox has been made possible by the modern heresy of Ecumenism, which allows two mutually exclusive doctrines to coexist, while pretending that the truth is either the mean between the two, or the lowest common denominator of the two, or something to be discovered in the future, or simply irrelevant if we all profess love one for another. Some conservative New Calendarists pretend that the Chambézy Agreement is not an official declaration of faith, but rather a series of recommendations by individual theologians, which the churches are free to accept or reject. The superficiality of this notion, however, is contradicted by the so-called pastoral agreement between the Coptic Orthodox and Greek Orthodox Patriarchates of Alexandria, which was signed in 2001. This document announces, the Holy Synods of both the Coptic Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria and all Africa have already accepted the outcome of the official dialogue on Christology between the Orthodox Church and the Oriental Orthodox Churches, including the two official agreements. The first on Christology signed in June 1989 in Egypt, which I did not quote, and the second also on Christology and on the lifting of anathemas and restoration of full communion signed in Geneva 1990, that is in Chambézy, in which it is stated that in the light of our agreed statement on Christology, we have now clearly understood that both families have always loyally maintained the same authentic Orthodox Christological faith and the unbroken continuity of apostolic tradition. It was agreed to have mutual recognition of the sacrament of baptism, based on what St. Paul wrote. one Lord, one faith, one baptism. The document further states, the Holy Synods of both patriarchates have agreed to accept the sacrament of marriage when it is conducted for two partners not belonging to the same patriarchate. Each of the two patriarchates shall also accept to perform all of its other sacraments to that new family of mixed Christian marriage. This document shows clearly that the Patriarchate of Alexandria regards the Chambéry Agreement as an official statement of doctrine, and not simply the private judgment of individuals. Moreover, the Patriarchate has officially recognized the Monophysites as constituting a church as valid and legitimate as the Orthodox Church. Indeed, it states that the Orthodox are of one faith when the Monophysites. Even more troubling is the decision of the Holy Synod of Antioch under Patriarch Ignatius IV, which was made in June 1991. With respect to its relations with the Syrian Monophysites, the Antiochian Church announced that the following measures would be observed. The complete and mutual respect between the two churches for their rituals, spirituality, heritage, and holy fathers. The incorporation of the fathers of both churches and their heritage in general in the Christian education curriculum and theological teaching. The refraining of accepting members of one church in the membership of the other, whatever the reasons may be. Organizing meetings of both synods whenever need and necessity might arise. If two bishops of the two different churches meet for a spiritual service, the one with the majority of people will preside. If one priest of either church happens to be in a certain area, he will serve the divine mysteries for members of both churches, including the divine liturgy and the sacrament of holy matrimony. If two priests of both churches happen to be in a certain community, they will take turns, and in case they can celebrate, the one with the majority of people will preside. If a bishop of one church and a priest from the sister church happen to concelebrate, presiding naturally belongs to the bishop. In other words, the Patriarchate of Antioch has entirely abandoned the Orthodox Church and is in full communion with the Monophysites. The Patriarchate has decided that the Ecumenical Councils, which embody the Church's definitive expressions of belief, are optional, and that it is not necessary to adhere to them to be part of the Orthodox Church. Thus, we see the heresy of Ecumenism operating on two levels. On the one hand, the New Calendar churches accept the basic idea that other Christian bodies are part of the Church, and that the Church is not exclusively synonymous with Orthodoxy. This is Ecumenism in theory. On the other hand, they recognize that specific heretical bodies, such as the Roman Catholic Church and the Monophysite churches, are in fact orthodox in doctrine, and they have even entered into communion with the Monophysites. This is Ecumenism and practice. Both of these forms of Ecumenism are operating in the New Calendar churches on the most official level possible. They have been publicly proclaimed by a patriarch and ratified by the Holy Synod. It is not possible for them to be any more official than they already are. Moreover, these official actions must not be considered in isolation, but in the context of Ecumenism's overall effect on the Church. Innumerable hierarchs have made blasphemous statements denying virtually every dogma of orthodoxy. Joint prayers are conducted with heretics on a regular basis. Communion is freely given to Roman Catholics and other heterodox, and agreements such as the so-called Ballamand Union and the recent appalling statement to the Ninth Assembly of the World Council of Churches are concluded by official delegates from the New Calendar's churches. These statements affirm the branch theory and a host of other errors. The heresy of Ecumenism has infected not one of the local Orthodox churches, but all of them. Each of the patriarchates has contributed in its own way to perverting the Orthodox faith. Constantinople by lifting the anathemas which the Holy Fathers laid on the Roman Catholic Church. Alexandria by accepting the Monophysites as Orthodox. Antioch by partaking of the same chalice as the Monophysites. And all the Ecumenist churches collectively by participating in the World Council of Churches and abolishing the patristic understanding of the Church. All of the ecumenist churches are in full communion with one another and share the same ecumenist faith. The beliefs of one are the beliefs of all, and each of the patriarchates supports and encourages the ecumenical gestures of the others. Our primary question at this point ought to be, what are the faithful to do when their bishops are in heresy? The patristic answer is clear. Break communion immediately, because those bishops no longer represent the Church, but a foreign body. It is impossible for Orthodox Christians to hold communion with heretical bishops, inasmuch as a common Eucharistic cup denotes a common faith. St. Cyril of Alexandria states that the body of Christ binds us into unity, and there is no division of belief among the faithful. And the Apostle Paul asks, what communion hath light with darkness, or what concord hath Christ with Belial? When the Monothelite Bishop Theodosius asked St. Maximus the Confessor why he had cut himself off from communion with the See of Constantinople, the saint replied, in the sixth indiction of the last cycle, Cyrus, Patriarch of Alexandria, published the nine chapters, stating that Christ had but a single energy, which were approved by the See of Constantinople. Soon, the novelties proposed in that document were followed by others, overturning the definitions of holy councils. These innovations were devised by primates of the Church of Constantinople, Sergius, Pyrrhus, and Paul, as all the other churches know very well. This is the reason I, your servant, am not in communion with the throne of Constantinople. Let the offenses introduced by those men be rejected, and the abettors deposed. Then the way to salvation will be cleared, and you will walk the smooth path of the gospel unhindered by heresy. When I see the Church of Constantinople walking as she was formerly, I shall enter into communion with her uncompelled. But as long as the scandal of heresy persists in her, and her bishops are miscreants, no argument or persecution will win me over to your side. On another occasion, the Eparch of Constantinople asked St. Maximus, will you enter into communion with our church or not? I will not, said the saint. Why? Asked the Eparch. Because it has rejected the rulings of Orthodox councils, said Maximus. The Eparch continued, if that be so, how is it that the fathers of those councils remain in the diptychs of our church? How do you profit by commemorating them when you renounce their doctrines, countered the saint. Examples such as these could be multiplied almost indefinitely. Suffice to say that the most basic criterion of Orthodox ecclesiology is to refrain from communion with heretical bishops. This applies even before such bishops are condemned by an ecumenical council, as we see from the case of St. Maximus, who broke communion decades before the condemnation of monoenergism and monothelitism by the Sixth Ecumenical Council. The sound application of these principles to the present-day situation should be obvious. Anyone who considers himself to be an Orthodox Christian should sever communion with any bishop who preaches, participates in, or furthers ecumenism directly or indirectly. And he should join himself to those Orthodox Christians who have already ceased ecclesiastical contact with such bishops. Those Christians are precisely the old calendarists, or true Orthodox Christians, who rejected the heresy of ecumenism the moment it appeared, and in no way allowed themselves to be defiled by communion with bishops who alter the faith of the apostles. When the conservative new calendarists take this same step, they will be following the path of the Holy Fathers. They will have separated themselves from the heretics and joined themselves to the assembly of the Orthodox. Thank you. The question is, what should the average person do in their response against ecumenism? How can they help in the struggle against ecumenism? And the first thing they can do is, and I'll repeat myself what I stated in my speech, is sever themselves from communion with any bishop who preaches ecumenism. This will have two effects. One, it will help their own personal spirituality, because this way they'll be separating themselves from a church which is falling away from the Catholicity of the church, which is falling away from the true Orthodox Church. And if they want to attain salvation, they must belong to that church which confesses the true Orthodox doctrines. The second effect that will have is it will send a very clear message to the heretical hierarchs that the faithful do not tolerate what they are doing. That it's that what they are doing is unacceptable to the body of Orthodox believers, and that if they continue to do so, they will end up with a church with no people in it. So, and furthermore, when a person breaks communion with the heretical hierarch, that sends a message to other people as well, so that it creates a sort of domino effect, and that ultimately leads to the restoration of orthodoxy in its fullness. And if you look at historically the way the church has dealt with different heresies that have risen in the course of its existence, various heresies have arisen, and the Orthodox faithful have severed themselves from communion with these heretical bishops, and gradually the accumulating impetus of those faithful had the effect of restoring the fullness of orthodoxy even to those bodies which were confessing a heresy. Now, sometimes that resulted in the return of the heretical body back to the Orthodox Church. For example, the Arians. There are no more Arians today. There's no Arian church. Sometimes, same thing with the iconoclasts. There is no iconoclast church per se today. Sometimes that resulted in the heretical group being definitively cut off from the Orthodox Church, such as, for example, the Monophysites. Inevitably, those groups which were cut off ended up being marginalized. So that first very important step is for each person to separate themselves from communion. And it's also very important simply to look to one's own personal spirituality. If one confesses orthodoxy in its dogmatic purity, one is inevitably led to the practice of Orthodox spirituality, because the Orthodox spirituality is simply the expression of Orthodox dogma in one's life. And when God sees the Orthodox Christians practicing the Christian life, He blesses the Orthodox Christians. And this will again lead to the restoration of orthodoxy in its fullness. We've been speaking a lot about the unity of the Church and how the Church is one, and how there's one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And I think most of us accept that as a truism, that there is one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And we've been applying this to a certain extent to the opposition of between the Orthodox Church and the heterodox churches, the Roman Catholic Church, the Monophysite churches, the Protestant churches. But it can be, that same principle can be and should be applied to the division between the old calendars and the new calendars. The fact is that what we see today as the Orthodox Church has been divided into two sections, the old calendars and the new calendars church. And if we accept and we believe in that principle of the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, we inevitably have to ask ourselves, which of these two churches, the Old Calendars Church or the New Calendars Church, is the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church? Either one of those two churches is either heretical and schismatic, or the other one is. They can't both be the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So what each individual person has to do is look at the facts and decide for themselves which of these two churches is the church. because they can't both be the one church. The two churches are in the diametrically opposed to each other. They condemn each other. So it's imperative for each person to examine and decide which of the two churches. And I think if any person looks honestly at the two churches and compares their qualities and their beliefs, they'll find that the Old Calendarist Church accepts simply what the Orthodox Church has believed throughout its historical existence, whereas what the New Calendarist Church believes, both on an official level and the beliefs that are rampant throughout the Church, throughout the hierarchy and throughout the theological bodies, is something very different from what Orthodoxy has traditionally believed. I want to address a point that was raised by the gentleman in the corner there. He said that while ecumenism is very problematic and is getting increasingly so, we have to follow our elders out. I would say that first of all, we Old Calendars did follow our elders out. There were many very holy spirit-bearing elders from Mount Athos who refused to accept the New Calendarist, in the innovation of the New Calendar, and moreover, all of the monasteries on Mount Athos ceased commemoration of the Patriarch when Patriarch Athenagoras in 1965, when he lifted the anathemas against the Roman Catholic Church. And there were many spirit-bearing elders on Mount Athos and outside of Mount Athos who refused to accept these innovations in ecumenism, and they separated communion from them. And these elders were known for being clairvoyant men, holy men of God. Then the second thing I would say is that the question of whether we should follow the elders is actually a secondary question, because in the Orthodox Church we don't dedicate ourselves to a personality. We make our decisions based on what the Church has taught throughout its history. In other words, we follow the teachings of the Church, not the teachings of an individual private person, no matter how pious a life he may seem to lead. So, although there are people in the New Calendarist Church who lead very pious lives and who are very respected monks, it's a false path to follow these people rather than what the teachings of the Church are. And I would add that it's sometimes very difficult to discern who is a spirit-bearing elder who's inspired by God and who is simply a very good person. If you look at the Roman Catholic Church, they've had many saints throughout their whole history. Some of their lives are very, very moving. If you look at the modern Monophysite Church, the Coptic Church, for example, I've read lives of Coptic saints from the modern period. In fact, their previous Patriarch Kyrillos VI, had a reputation for being a holy man, and all the Copts swear that he worked miracles. They swear that he was clairvoyant. But why did this man not convert to Orthodoxy? You can answer that in several ways. You could say maybe he was in very subtle delusion, very subtle planning. Or you can say that maybe God had something in store for him that that we don't know. But I think all of us would agree that the fact that a Monophysite saint, quote unquote, remained in the Monophysite Church was not a good thing. He ought to have become Orthodox. It would have been much better for him to become Orthodox. And I imagine he would have become much holier if he had become Orthodox than if he had stayed there. And the same thing applies to these so-called New Calendarist elders. If they, what exactly is taking place with them spiritually, I can't say. I can't judge any individual person. But the right thing for them to do is to return to the Old Calendarist Church. And I think that if they do that, God will bless them many more times in the Old Calendarist Church than He has in the New Calendarist Church.
In a way that they are, in one way or another, inspired.
The question is, what do we do about people like Saint Isaac the Syrian, who is traditionally been considered within the Orthodox Church to be a saint, and yet he was he supposedly held doctrines which were not Orthodox. Actually, he was not the Monophysite bishop of Nineveh. He was the Nestorian bishop of Nineveh. He lived during the 7th century. And the 7th century was a time during which the Church of Persia, the church which was geographically located in modern-day Iraq and Iran, and which actually during the 7th century was spreading all the way to China. During that same period, they were in the process of accepting Nestorian doctrines. So the question is, what do we do with a person like Saint Isaac? Now, Saint Isaac, the problem is that what is called the Church of Persia at that time had not entirely separated itself from the Orthodox Church. It was a long and drawn-out process in which it is very difficult to ascertain at what particular point they cut themselves off from the church. It appears that by the Middle Ages they had entirely separated them from the Orthodox Church, and they were considered to be so by both the Orthodox and themselves. But at that time, during the 7th century, they had accepted. There was a strong movement within their church to accept Nestorian beliefs, but there was also a very large group in the church which did not accept these beliefs, or accepted perhaps part of them, but considered themselves nevertheless to be of one faith of the churches of Rome and of Constantinople and the other Orthodox churches of the West, as they refer to them. So it's very difficult to state that at that time, at the time when Saint Isaac was a bishop of that church, that church was entirely in heresy, because at that time, for example, the patriarch, I believe his name was George, and he may even have been the Catholicos, they called them, the Catholicos who ordained Saint Isaac. He wrote a synodical letter stating that we hold the same faith as the churches of Italy and Rome and Constantinople and Jerusalem. So it's very difficult to state that Saint Isaac was not actually an Orthodox saint, that he was a Nestorian. He belonged to that church which very soon was to become Nestorian. But I don't think that you can state definitively that at the time that he lived, that it was clearly a Nestorian church. This actually is related to a larger question of what is the process by which a church abandons orthodoxy and enters into heresy. And it's been actually a very divisive one amongst the Old Calendarists. It's been stated amongst the Old Calendarists at what point is grace lost by a church which is entering into heresy. And I think if you look historically at the development of various heresies, it's very difficult to pinpoint one particular point at which the grace goes on and off like a light switch. There comes a point at which it's clear that both sides consider the other to be an alien body. And the same problem exists, for example, with the Roman Catholic Church. The anathema, the heresy of the filioque and of the papacy existed within the Roman Catholic Church from the end of the 8th century, and it existed within the West, festering, so to speak, for several hundred years. In 1054, the churches of Rome and Constantinople excommunicated each other precisely over these doctrinal points. But intercommunion between Rome and the other Orthodox patriarchies did not stop immediately in 1054. It didn't stop. Intercommunion between Rome and Jerusalem did not cease until the First Crusade. In 1099, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem, and the next year in 1100, they replaced the Orthodox patriarch with a Latin patriarch. The Patriarchate of Alexandria appears to have remained in communion with Rome all the way up until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1214 or 15. But at the same time remaining in communion with the Patriarchate of Constantinople and the other Orthodox patriarchates. So any time when you have a heresy which is developing within the Orthodox Church, there exists a period of time in which the ecclesial position of the body which is going into heresy is somewhat in doubt, what its ultimate status is. And sometimes you will find...